What if the real danger to human life
wasn't violence or catastrophe, but comfort? What if the enemy of human greatness wasn't fear or chaos, but the quiet drift into mediocrity, into lives without challenge, struggle, or meaning? Friedrich Nietzsche looked at modern Europe and saw exactly that. Not a world in collapse, but a world in spiritual decline. A world that no longer believed in the moral, religious, and metaphysical truths that had once held it together, yet still lived as if those truths were intact. When Nietzsche wrote that God is dead, he wasn't making a theological claim. He wasn't saying that God had once existed and now did not. He was describing a cultural event, the slow erosion of belief in absolute values. The divine order that had structured Western life, its morality, its purpose, its explanation for suffering, had been hollowed out by science, historical awareness, and the modern emphasis on human autonomy. And yet, the shadows of those beliefs remained. People still behaved as if there were universal truths, while no longer believing in what gave those truths weight. Nietzsche saw this as deeply unstable, a spiritual crisis that would eventually surface as disorientation, anxiety, and nihilism. But nihilism wasn't the end for Nietzsche. It was the beginning of a deeper question. If the old values no longer hold, what comes next? If meaning is no longer given to us from above, can it be created from within? This is where Nietzsche introduces one of his most enduring and misunderstood ideas, the Übermensch. Not a perfect man, not a political ruler, and certainly not a superhuman in any modern sense. The Übermensch is a figure of possibility. Someone who has confronted the death of old truths and chosen not to collapse, but to create. Someone who overcomes themselves, affirms life as it is, and becomes the author of new values. In a world drifting toward comfort, distraction, and the herd instinct, Nietzsche's challenge is this: can we become something more than what we've been? Can we face the abyss without retreating into illusion and build something true in the ruins of what once gave us certainty? That is the question behind the Übermensch, not who he is, but whether we are willing to become.
When Nietzsche declared, "God is dead," he wasn't making a flamboyant attack on religion. He was naming a quiet, cultural transformation already underway. Belief in God, or more accurately, belief in a transcendent, absolute moral order, was no longer intellectually sustainable in modern Europe. Science had displaced creation myths. Historical criticism had unraveled sacred texts. The Enlightenment had elevated human reason above divine command. And yet, many still clung to inherited moral frameworks, as if the structure of Christian ethics could survive without the metaphysical foundation that once justified it. For Nietzsche, this contradiction was unsustainable. Without belief in God, the authority of moral systems like good and evil no longer carried any weight beyond social convention or emotional habit. And yet, society continued to act as though these values were binding, as if their roots had not been severed. Nietzsche saw this as a form of self-deception. We continued to use the language of morality without acknowledging that its foundation had been lost. This crisis was not merely philosophical, it was existential. When the highest values lose their value, what remains? If there is no divine plan, no objective purpose, and no eternal reward or punishment, what justifies the struggle of life? What justifies suffering? What justifies restraint? Without a new grounding, humanity risks falling into nihilism, not in theory, but in daily life. A sense that nothing truly matters, that everything is arbitrary, and that moral distinctions are illusions we're too afraid to question. Nietzsche understood that this collapse would not lead to immediate chaos. In fact, the danger was the opposite. He feared the rise of a tranquil, shallow society, one that continues to behave morally out of habit but no longer believes in its own foundations. A society that prizes comfort over truth, conformity over courage, and routine over risk. In this context, the death of God is not just a philosophical turning point, it is the disappearance of a spiritual horizon that once gave human life depth, danger, and direction. But Nietzsche does not romanticize the past. He does not mourn the loss of religious certainty as something that should be restored. Instead, he insists that if the old values have collapsed, then we must take responsibility for what comes next. If God is dead, then man must become something greater, not by imitating divine commandments, but by generating new values rooted in life itself. The death of God is not the end of meaning. It is the end of borrowed meaning.
With the death of God comes a deeper and more personal challenge: nihilism. Nietzsche did not invent this concept, but he gave it new psychological weight. Nihilism for him is not simply the belief that life has no meaning, it's the emotional and cultural experience of meaninglessness after the collapse of the values that once gave life purpose. When the structures that anchored human morality, ambition, and suffering disappear, the question becomes not just how to live, but why. Nietzsche categorized nihilism in two forms: passive and active. Passive nihilism is resignation. It's the quiet despair of the one who no longer believes but still drifts through life as if he does. It is marked by disinterest, conformity, and the desire to avoid pain rather than seek transformation. This is the condition that gives rise to Nietzsche's figure of the last man, the one who chooses comfort over depth, safety over risk, and contentment over excellence. The last man is not evil. He is not malicious or tyrannical. In fact, he may appear entirely decent and well-adjusted. But what makes him dangerous is precisely his satisfaction with mediocrity. He no longer believes in anything great, and worse, he no longer cares. He rejects struggle and avoids all forms of existential discomfort. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche describes him as saying, "We have invented happiness," and then he blinks. This blinking is not an act of insight, but of indifference. For Nietzsche, the last man is the inevitable product of a society that has lost its spiritual grounding and replaced it with distraction, entertainment, and social consensus. He represents the endpoint of passive nihilism, a humanity that has stopped aspiring, that no longer dreams, and that views suffering not as a challenge to overcome, but as something to eliminate at all costs. What makes this figure so threatening is that he doesn't rebel or destroy. He simply settles. He neutralizes greatness by lowering the standard of what it means to live well. In a world of last men, those who seek truth, who strive for something higher, who are willing to risk suffering for creation or discovery, they are dismissed as naive, dangerous, or mad. Nietzsche's fear was not that the world would end in violence, but that it would wither in mediocrity. That humanity would no longer give birth to greatness because it would no longer believe it was necessary. The last man is not a villain. He is a warning. He is what we become when we refuse the burden of freedom and the weight of becoming something more.
But Nietzsche does not leave us here.
He offers a counterpoint to the last man, not in the form of a political system or religious revival, but in a new kind of human being. One who does not retreat from nihilism, but moves through it. One who turns the collapse of old values into the ground from which new values can be created. That figure is the Übermensch.
At the heart of Nietzsche's vision of the human condition
Is a concept he calls the will to power. It is not a political doctrine, nor is it a call for physical domination. It is a metaphysical principle, a description of how life, all life, expresses itself. The will to power is the fundamental drive that animates existence, the drive to expand, to assert, to shape, to overcome resistance, and to transform both the world and the self. Nietzsche believed that this drive is more basic than the will to survive. Survival, he thought, is only one expression of a deeper force, a force that wants not just to endure, but to become more. Plants stretch toward the sun, artists challenge the limits of form, thinkers break with tradition. These are all manifestations of the same inner impulse, not to stay the same, but to grow, test boundaries, and shape reality according to one's strength. Crucially, Nietzsche did not equate the will to power with external domination. That was a misreading, later abused by political ideologies he would have despised. For Nietzsche, the highest expression of the will to power is not the conquest of others, but the conquest of oneself. The ability to face suffering without retreat, to endure uncertainty without false consolation, and to affirm life in all its complexity, these are the true marks of inner strength. This idea also reshapes how Nietzsche sees morality. Traditional moral systems, particularly those rooted in Christian values, often glorify humility, self-denial, and obedience. Nietzsche saw this as a kind of spiritual stagnation. He argued that these values emerged from weakness, a strategy by which the powerless could frame their condition as virtuous, and label the strong as evil. What masqueraded as moral truth, he believed, was often a concealed expression of resentment, a revaluation of strength as sin, and weakness as holiness. But the will to power offers an alternative. It is the force by which the individual refuses to be defined by inherited values and instead begins to create their own. This is not an invitation to selfishness or cruelty. It is a demand for responsibility. The responsibility to live without excuses, to face the full weight of existence, and to become the kind of person who does not need illusions to act with purpose. In this way, the will to power is the psychological and existential foundation of the Übermensch. It is the force that drives him to transform what he is given, not only his conditions, but himself. He does not merely react to the world, he imposes meaning upon it because he recognizes that no higher source will do it for him. Where the last man seeks comfort and security, the Übermensch embraces struggle and transcendence, and it is the will to power that enables that leap.
If Nietzsche is remembered for any single idea beyond the Übermensch, it is his radical rethinking of morality. In his view, most people do not choose their values, they inherit them. They adopt the beliefs of their culture, their religion, or their family without question, and then treat these beliefs as universal truths. Nietzsche challenges this assumption. He asks not whether a value is right or wrong, but who created it and why. In On the Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche draws a distinction between two moral frameworks, master morality and slave morality. Master morality arises from strength, vitality, and confidence. It defines good in terms of power, creativity, and life affirmation. The nobleman in this framework sees himself as the source of value. He doesn't ask for permission to act. He affirms what is life-enhancing and calls it good. Slave morality, by contrast, arises from resentment, from weakness that cannot express itself directly. It reverses the nobleman's values. Instead of celebrating strength, it labels strength as evil. Instead of affirming life, it glorifies suffering and submission. Good, in this morality, becomes whatever alleviates pain, protects the weak, and punishes the strong. This moral inversion, Nietzsche argues, is not a discovery of truth. It is a psychological strategy of the powerless to cope with their condition. Nietzsche's critique is not a call for cruelty or domination. It is a challenge to the assumption that our inherited values are eternal, objective, or unquestionable. He wants to strip morality of its sacredness, not to leave us in ethical chaos, but to free us to become creators of value. If traditional morality is a construct, then we have the power and the responsibility to construct something better. This is where the figure of the Übermensch re-enters. He is not immoral, but beyond conventional morality. He does not accept inherited rules simply because they are old. He examines the origins of values, discards what is life-denying, and creates principles that are grounded in life itself, in strength, affirmation, and becoming. He does not seek approval from others, nor does he hide behind commandments. His values arise from his own depth and clarity. But this is not relativism. Nietzsche is not saying that all values are equal. He is saying that values must be earned, forged in the crucible of struggle, awareness, and individual confrontation with the world. The Übermensch is not simply someone who breaks rules. He is someone who has gone beyond the need for rules, designed for the many. He has developed his own ethic, not in isolation, but in response to the real challenges of existence. To live beyond good and evil is not to reject all distinctions, but to take full responsibility for the values by which one lives. It is to refuse moral passivity and instead become the source of meaning. That is the moral revolution Nietzsche calls for. Not rebellion for its own sake, but the recreation of values by those who are strong enough to carry the weight. The Übermensch, or overman, is not a person Nietzsche believed already existed. He is an ideal, a vision of what a human being might become if they fully confronted the collapse of traditional values and chose, instead of despair or retreat, to build something new. To understand the Übermensch, we must see him as the opposite of the last man. Where the last man seeks comfort, sameness, and security, the Übermensch embraces challenge, difference, and the burden of creating meaning. Nietzsche's Übermensch is not a superhero, not an aristocrat, not a conqueror. He is the creator of values.
That phrase, creator of values, is central. Most people inherit values from religion, culture, nation, family. These values are assumed to be universal, but Nietzsche asks us to step back and question where they came from. Who created them? Who benefited from them? And more importantly, do they affirm life or deny it? The Übermensch is someone who no longer accepts inherited morality at face value. He sees that old systems of good and evil were often built on fear, resentment, or the desire to control. Rather than cling to them, he moves beyond good and evil. That does not mean he rejects all ethics. It means he no longer lives by borrowed beliefs. He creates his own code, not based on abstract ideals, but rooted in his experience of life. But this kind of independence does not come easily. Nietzsche knew that the process of becoming an Übermensch begins in collapse. One must pass through nihilism, the experience of meaninglessness that follows the death of all inherited truths. Most people stop here. They fall back into comfort or adopt new dogmas to fill the void. But the Übermensch moves through nihilism, facing it honestly without illusions, and emerges on the other side with the strength to create new meaning. Here, the will to power becomes crucial. This is not the will to dominate others, but the drive to overcome, not just the world, but the self. The Übermensch continually confronts his own limitations, assumptions, and fears. He does not try to become someone else. He tries to become who he already is, but more fully, more courageously, more consciously. This is what Nietzsche means when he writes, "Become who you are." Another test Nietzsche offers is the thought experiment of eternal recurrence. Imagine that you must live your exact life, every joy, every mistake, every loss, over and over again for eternity. Would you curse it or would you embrace it? The Übermensch affirms it. He says yes to life without needing it to be perfect. His affirmation is not naive. It includes suffering, loss, failure. This is what separates the Übermensch from both the religious believer and the passive nihilist. He does not deny the world in hopes of a better one. He does not hide from meaninglessness in distractions. He lives without false promises and yet still chooses to live deeply, intensely, and on his own terms. Nietzsche does not promise that anyone will reach this ideal. In fact, he believed most would not. The path is too difficult, too lonely, too demanding. But the Übermensch is not a goal everyone must achieve. He is a challenge, a mirror, a question. He forces us to ask, are we living lives we would willingly repeat forever? Are we affirming existence as it is, or are we waiting for something to save us from it? To become an Übermensch is to reject borrowed meaning, face life without illusions, and then build a self and a world that are fully your own. It is to live not according to what is easy or safe, but according to what is true for you, even when it costs you everything. The Übermensch is not an answer for the masses. He is not a utopian dream or a blueprint for society. He is a response to a specific kind of human crisis, the one that begins when all inherited meaning collapses and nothing feels certain anymore. In that space of doubt, most look backward, trying to restore what has been lost. Nietzsche asks us to do the opposite, to look forward and take responsibility for what comes next.
The Übermensch is not someone else to follow. He is the question that life poses back to you. Now that the old truths are gone, who will you become? That's the burden of existence in a post-metaphysical world. Not to find meaning, but to make it. Not to be saved, but to rise. If this content challenged you, sit with it. Don't just agree or disagree. Ask yourself, what values are you living by? And where did they come from? Are you becoming someone out of habit or out of truth? If you want more in-depth content like this, real philosophy, without the shortcuts, subscribe, comment with your own reflections, and share this with someone who still believes growth is worth the struggle.
No illusions,
No borrowed meaning, just the honest question, are you becoming who you are?